Yeah. So what we're addressing initially is the reality that the Supreme Court, the United States, struck down a law banning sports betting by the states and really handed it back over to the states' jurisdictions. And I didn't realize this, that Oregon, I mean, you guys have had sports betting on your books that predate the 1992 law that banned it. It's just that I think there was some sports betting for about a year in Oregon, and then it stopped because the NCAA said we wouldn't hold any events in Oregon if there was sports betting. That was just one of the reasons. Now that it's been legalized, what I'm reading is that the Oregon Lottery is aggressively pursuing the idea of how to implement and integrate sports betting as part of the Oregon Lottery, which is interesting.
Yeah, so that's where it lay. That's where it laid before it lied before the legislature and the governor asked them not to do that any longer so that they could bring the NCAA tournaments to our state. So They are taking that under consideration as they need to generate not necessarily more revenue, but they need to sustain the revenue that they're generating.
Right.
And so that is an option. They're waiting to see, what we've been told is that they're waiting to see where other states go and what comes out of this, and and then they're in talks with the governor about what her wishes are, and also around if there's going to be any regulation around sports betting and who's going to uphold those regulations, I suppose. So I looked at our prevalence study from 2016, and about 6% of the population said they do sports betting.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and of course, what any of the regulators look at is if we want to sustain our level of play or profitability, then there has to be a way of expanding the player base. I mean, that's always a part of the equation. And so they would be viewing this as a vehicle or as a means to expand the player base. And then the question becomes, I mean, there's already kids and young adults, in their 20s and 30s in Oregon that are clearly betting sports online. That the question is, can we convert some of those dollars that don't get taxed, that the state doesn't get any revenue from, can we transfer that into revenue producing? And then if we legalize that, is that going to attract more players? And then if it does, then it makes sense that you all are going to see people in the programs, more people with sports betting problems. Doesn't that just follow?
Yeah, that's probably true.
Yeah. So I think in the times I've been out there, what I'm aware of is that a lot of treatment providers in Oregon don't really work with sports betting and may not know, some of how it works. So I thought that we might talk a little bit about that, because I'll tell you, I mean, here in Texas, even though there's no, well, actually, I think there's one tribal casino in El Paso, but Texas obviously is surrounded by New Mexico, Oklahoma, Louisiana, all of which have land-based casinos, a number of land-based casinos, but it's quite a drive, for example, from Austin. It's about a 4-hour drive, or actually longer, to get to the Oklahoma border, about 3.5, 4 hours to get to the Louisiana border, and probably 8 hours to get over to New Mexico. So people have to drive quite a ways, but they do that to get to the casinos. But a fair amount of my caseload here in Austin is with people who have sports betting problem, mostly men, but some women. And so there's a particular kind of dynamic with that I wanted to alert you guys to, if you're not already familiar with it. And there's some interesting wrinkles in it too. So what I thought I'd do for this talk, and by the way, what I'm hoping is that some of you have some questions or some issues that you can throw in, and to me that's more important than what I've come up with to talk with you about. Because if you're saying, hey Chris, I got a question for you, then you're telling me this is where you are and what's challenging you, and I'd rather address that first than me just try and make some guesses at what's going on. So and if absent feedback, I'm here doing a kind of a one-way radio show. So I really appreciate you guys jumping in at any point in time. So let me ask you before I jump into any sports betting issues, and I've got a couple of other items that I put down on my list to talk with you guys about that I think are kind of interesting. So before I go there, any of you all out there have any questions, thoughts, comments, observations that you want to throw out yet? I'll take that as a not yet. So in the old days, and I've never placed a bet on sports. I think I've shared with you guys before, 100% of my gambling was in the securities markets back in the 1980s. And all that was traded was called market index options. So what I know about sports betting, I've learned from however many hundreds of gamblers that I've worked with over the years whose main problem was sports betting. And most of those from up in the Chicago area, where I was for 28 years until a few years ago. And so the way it used to work in the old days, and I'm talking about before internet, is that an individual, if they wanted to bet sports, would have to have a bookie. And at least in the Chicago area, most all the bookies, they were not independent. They were connected to the mob or the outfit, whatever you wanted to call them. And so the way somebody would place a bet is they would pick up the phone, go to a phone, make a phone call into the bookie and say, I want I believe the Oregon Ducks are going to win the game by 6 points. I mean, if the spread is 6.5 points, what you want is them to cover, which means you want them to win, but you have to have them win by more than 6.5 points in order to collect. And what you do is for every dollar that you put up, when you bet a dollar and you lose your dollar. When you win, you collect 90 cents. Now, the other way of talking about that is that there's what's called the VIG or the vigorish or the juice. Really, it's more the VIG or the vigorish, which is what the bookmaker makes. And basically, they don't care who wins or loses. If they have $1,000 bet on both sides, then they make their 10%. And so they're in effect the house. So basically, a sports bettor in the old days, you would make a call and you'd pick your team and maybe you'd call in on Thursday and you'd wait for the game to be played on Saturday or Sunday. And I'm not just picking Thursday. There would be a cutoff time before the start of the game where you couldn't place your bet. But you'd place the bet and then you'd wait for the game to be played. And then after the game was played, you'd find out whether you won or lost. And then usually most places, sometimes Monday afternoon, usually on Tuesdays, then you would settle up with the bookie. When Monday Night Football came along, that was known as the catch-up game. People who would lose money on the games on the weekend and would load up on Monday Night Football, chasing with the hope of getting the money back. So basically, you settled up with your bookie on Tuesday. And that was in the form of meeting the bookie someplace and handing them a brown paper bag or whatever it happens to be with the cash in it. And if you didn't have the money, then there were some problems. There were guys that I knew in Chicago in the old days who were threatened, but But the problem is that that if the bookies really hurt you, then you wouldn't be able to keep playing and keep feeding them money. And so a lot of the stuff that you read about bookies is Hollywood. The people that you get into trouble with would be loan sharks, which would be people you'd go to who weren't the bookie. They'd be somebody else, and they would lend you money in order to bet, and you would have to pay them back exorbitant sums of money. Now, with sports betting, what I run into along those lines with, especially a lot of younger people that I work with, where their mom and dad are involved in bailing them out, they live with this fear that if they don't, in fact, I'm seeing a kid at 6 o'clock this afternoon that got into trouble with some people lending him money at the card rooms here in Chicago. And mom was bailing him out and real afraid that these people were going to hurt them. And I said, let's think this through. Your son is not doing anything illegal by playing cards at the card room. He's not doing anything illegal by borrowing money from somebody. But the person who might come after him is guilty of all kinds of illegal acts, such as money laundering, mail fraud, wire fraud, extortion, blackmail. And I said, now why would somebody jeopardize their own safety or their own freedom by threatening your 19-year-old son over a couple of $1,000s? Unless it's to get to you, to scare you, to get you to pay the money. And so a lot of times when I'm working with families, that's a typical education piece that I will give to them is there's, most of the threats are made up, and it's used by the gambler in order to basically extort money out of mom or dad. So that's just a little side piece, but in the old days, that's how it worked, and that was obviously before cell phones, and in the old days, in Gamblers Anonymous in Chicago, guys would talk about it being 20 below, and them having to leave the house and go to the payphone down, 3 blocks down the corner, or the bar 2 or 3 blocks down the street to call in and place their bets. And then you have the advent of cell phones, and which then increases the level of communication. And then you can imagine the democratization of all of that. And then as a result of the success of RICO, the racketeering, federal racketeering laws, a lot of the mobs were broken up. And then the bookies simply were, a lot of them were sole practitioners, as it were. I've testified in federal court for some bookies, and most of the bookies that I knew were actually compulsive gamblers who figured out a way, who decided that it was better to be, if I'm taking bets, if I'm taking bets from you, then you got to be paying me an extra 10%. And so that 10% is money that I get to use in order to do my own gambling. And so there were really compulsive gamblers who also booked. And in the federal cases, the feds, in one case, I've got a stack of federal wire transcripts, probably 3 feet tall, where they would keep somebody under surveillance for 2 to 3 years until finally they would, they would arrest them, charge them with mail fraud, wire fraud, whatever it happens to be. Well, now what's happened is that, and by the way, in the old days, you had to look long and hard to find what the odds were. They'd be in the back of the newspaper or something like that. Now all the sports talk shows and everybody talks, what's the line? What's the line? What's the line? What's the spread? Now, what you would do would be bet on individual games, but you could also do something called a parlay. And a parlay is when you would bet 2 or 3 games, and in order to win multiples of what you had at risk, you would have to bet and win, say, a three game parlay. You'd bet on 3 different teams to win their games, and if all of them won, then you'd win a tremendous amount of money. So it was a way of leveraging that. Well, all that progressed, and then with the internet, what happened was that the bookies then, a lot of them went online with their mechanism of placing bets and collecting money and transferring money, and that's been one of the big issues. Then they opened there were not only the online casinos down in Costa Rica, but also the online sports books, and there were various laws passed that interrupted all of that. And so what's happened with this new legislation is that it potentially is opening the floodgates to a whole new dimension of gambling, similar, not quite the same maybe, but similar to what occurred with the opening of all the casinos. And we all know in every state when the casinos were legalized, then the percentage of the population that was exposed to it was dramatically increased and the problems increased. So so there's the betting that's a single game, but what I also read that Oregon is talking about doing, and they're looking into, and this is something that's important for you guys to know. Let me see, I'm looking at an article out of from the Oregonian. So they're talking about, single game wagering where you simply bet on the game. But then there's something in sports betting called proposition bets. Proposition bets are, could be anything. It could be a bet on how many touchdown passes were thrown, how many fumbles there were, baseball, how many home runs, separate from who won the game and what the score was. You can bet on all different aspects. You can even reduce it down to make a bet whether the next pitch, if you have a mechanism of getting the bet in fast enough, you can make a bet on whether the next pitch is a ball or a strike. And so you can imagine when you have that element involved, it dramatically increases the level of toxicity or potency, if you will, of the drug by multiples. So what I read was that, let me see if I can find it here in this article. Let me see. Basically, what they're well, I thought I had it. What Oregon is talking about is expanding from, the initial is single game betting, but also to more of a streaming kind of betting where the odds change consistently, and you can make multiple wagers during the course of a game. You can bet on a halftime score, you can bet on a quarter score, you can bet on whether the next play is a touchdown. So theoretically, somebody could be sitting at home or at the stadium watching the football game being played, and on their phone, literally placing a money wager on what the next play is going to be. So knowing that basically tells us that that this disease, if you will, is constantly evolving and constantly progressing with the advances in technology. Remember when the very first lottery, I think, was in New Hampshire in 1964. And I don't know what the date was. I guess it could be researched. But the question is, when was the very first $1 million lottery? Well, my guess is whenever that was, it made national news. The next time there was $1 million lottery, it didn't make the news. It took a $2 million lottery or a $5 million lottery. Right now, I couldn't tell you what the lottery is. It's probably in the tens of millions. All you got to do is look at the billboards, or not the lottery, but the big game or Powerball, whatever it happens to be. But I can guarantee you that if that lottery crosses a certain threshold, it will appear on it will be announced on the national news what the Powerball number is, right? So what we're measuring simply with the lottery is that phenomena that we understand in addiction of increased tolerance, is that it takes more and more and more in order to get the desired effect. In other words, in order for the lottery to roll into the collective conscience as manifested by the newscasters saying the lottery's at 500 million. People will say, well, I went and bought a lottery ticket. Well, why? Well, because it was at 500 million. And I'm thinking, well, why didn't you buy a lottery ticket at 100 million? First of all, it wasn't in the news at 100 million. I mean, what's wrong with winning $100 million? Well, nothing. But it doesn't cross that threshold into our consciousness. So there's the increase level. We have to keep having more and more and more in order to get the desired effect. And that's exactly what's happening here with the state lotteries. In order to, and I'm not picking on Oregon, it's everyone, not just lotteries, but casinos. And you all know that the horse racing business is Go ahead, yes. Say again?
I'm sorry, it was me. I just got some noise going on accident.
Oh, okay.
This is Raul,
okay,
sorry.
Well, yeah, not a problem. So what happens is that the horse racing business is dead, basically, completely subsidized by casinos. And so what they've done in a lot of states is they've turned the racetracks into casinos, and they call them racinos. And so the whole gambling business is constantly looking for ways of increasing the potency and the availability of the product, which always increases the addictive quality of it. So what I want you all to be aware of is that there is going to be an impact in Oregon. It would not surprise me, since Oregon already has the law on the books and it's just been dormant, for there to be an expansion of gambling in Oregon to include sports betting of some sort. And when that happens, you will begin to see that population in your offices. Now, what's interesting about that is that, you know, unlike a slot machine where most people, I mean, there are some people who claim to be great slot machines players and claim to have a system. A lot of other people don't. You know, they just play whatever one has their favorite music or they like the lights on it. But with sports betting, there is both the reality and the illusion that there is some degree of skill involved. And there will be, like horse racing, there will be people who spend hours handicapping the games. It was going back, looking through all the stats and say, okay, well, this pitcher is, you know, wins 80% of his games when he's pitching at home on sunny days when the temperature is above 80 degrees. And so they look at all different stats, put them all together and say, okay, I believe this team is favored. And that's who I'm going to bet on. And so there is a lot of work for gamblers, for some gamblers, that goes into deciding who they're going to choose, who they're going to bet on, which is different from many slots players who in many ways don't want to think at all. They don't want to make the decision except which machine to play. And beyond that, all you're doing is you're pushing a button or pulling a lever. And basically, it's the machine that's programmed to determine what happens next. I'm not making any choices, even though I may operate under the illusion of choices. So I think it's a significant occurrence, and those of you who work with the population would do well to follow what the state of Oregon is going to be doing with this. And do what you can to educate yourself about sports betting and how you work with it. There's another pattern with sports betting too. A lot of times a typical profile would be a guy who grew up, again, it's mostly, at this point, mostly men, but I think if and when it becomes legal, it will spread out more, and I think there will be more women gambling. But one of the typical profiles is, and there's a guy I'm visiting with on Friday who's in legal trouble for his sports betting and getting involved in moving money around in an illegal way that the feds were not happy with. Who fancied himself as a hot shot athlete in high school and played some college ball. And so those guys think that somehow they understand the game in a way that other people don't. And they may be exactly right about that. The problem is that it doesn't really matter because you don't control which way the ball goes. You don't control whether the guy throws an over-the-shoulder shot with no time left on the clock and hits the basket and alters the spread, and you lose the game. I mean, ultimately, you have no control over the outcome. So they think that they have a leg up. They think they're smarter than everybody else. And that's one of the pieces that you have to deal with. So sports betting is referred to at times as a game of skill, but I think all the studies have shown you do just as well if you close your eyes and you just throw darts. All right, so that's just a little piece in the news that I wanted to alert you guys to if you weren't aware. And before I switch gears, let me ask you guys if you have any comments, questions. And I'm also curious if any of you have worked with any sports bettors, any of you that are online. Nope. Okay. Raul, have you? Sergio, you there?
I'm sorry, were you referring to me?
Yeah,
Chris?
yeah, you there?
Were you addressing me? Yes, I'm here, yes.
Yeah,
yes,
you work with any sports bettors?
No, not really. Not on sports betting. But
okay.
It's just very interesting what you were mentioning about, what we see on TV or Hollywood, where a booker will not come over and break the golden egg.
Yeah.
I never saw it that way, so that's helpful.
Doesn't that make sense? And also, if they do that, they call attention to themselves.
Right.
Which is probably the last thing they want to do. But it's a great threat to get in trouble. But that's Hollywood stuff, especially in this day and time.
Yes, well, and then maybe just cockfighting. I don't think that's a counts as sports betting.
Well, I'm thinking that for some people it absolutely would. I mean, if at one level, if you think about it, and let's see, and I've seen some cockfights, I think down in Puerto Rico or something like that. But the guys who work with those aren't those animals bred to fight?
Yeah, that's right, and they're trained and all those. Yeah, it's a whole.
Okay, so what, in a sense, what would be the difference between that and, I mean, other than the obvious difference in horse racing, where the training is to train a horse to beat all the other horses, and that's just who's the fastest, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yes.
So there's a lot of money, time, effort, and energy that goes into training those animals to be fighters. And so I would say that there's probably a way of people saying, well, this trainer typically has much better animals than that guy, or this bird has, hadn't been defeated in 10 fights, or, I don't know what the lifespan of one of the birds is. Probably not very long.
No. Yeah, it's yes. Well, definitely then I need to update my catalog here, and then just see that as sports betting.
I think it is. I mean, it's certainly classified as a sport in certain cultures, is it not?
I believe so.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, illegal as it may be, that doesn't really matter. But it's still wagering. People are wagering on the outcome of an event that they don't have any control over unless they happen to have drugged one of the birds and nobody else knows about it. You know? So, yeah, I think that would be classified as a sporting event. You know.
Okay.
So, all right,
All right. Thank you.
all right. Let me shift. Okay, anybody else?
I don't know. You can hear me or not. This is
I
Sergio
can.
Gutierrez.
Yes, I can.
Thanks. Yes, you asked about if I have a case. Yes, I have a case. A person who came over here with a horse racing. Immediately when you said about horsing, horse, I mean racing. Yes, I got the case, and it was kind of odd for me in the beginning. And
In
we
what
start
way?
talking about it. Pardon me? Go ahead.
In what way?
I was used to talk with people about machines, slot machines,
Yes,
and, and the casinos and the restaurants, and
yes.
talking about those. And with this person coming, like, oops, what are you gonna do with them, with him?
Right, right,
And
right.
then, yeah, it was interesting. He told me a lot about horses because he grew up in the horses and he worked with horses until he moved on.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
It was interesting case for me.
Well, it is, and you always learn something. And I've probably said this to you guys before, but I, I, I have a great deal of expertise in understanding gambling addiction, but I am not an expert in gambling. I mean, I rode horses to herd cattle on my family's ranch here in Texas. I've never seen a horse race. You know, I don't know how to handicap a horse race. I played penny ante poker, when I was in high school. I couldn't tell you how to count cards or play poker. I don't handicap sports betting. So what I'm saying that to you by way of saying there are all kinds of gambling that I really don't know about the details of the gambling. And you're not either. I mean, if you understand more about the machines and that sort of thing, and that's helpful. But I think what I'm saying to you is that you don't need to know a lot about the horses. Somebody will teach you. And I think that's our posture. It's like, look, I don't understand the horses much. Tell me. But as you're listening to them tell you about the horses, what you're also listening for and recognizing the reality is that they're in your office because they got a problem. And it's kind of like, well, was this person's problem horse racing?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
Yes, actually, he was deep in trouble with money because of the he lost money in a horse
Okay.
betting through TV. It was I don't know how they call it, but it's one
Simulcast. Simulcast, where they bet on races on television.
Yes,
Yeah.
and pretty much he had a group of people, family and friends, that he trusts him a lot because he knew about the horses.
Right.
But he got in trouble to the point he lost the house.
Right. Okay. So here's the thing. Here's what you do know.
Mm-hmm.
You may not know anything about horses except that they have 4 legs and they run in a circle, for a horse race, right?
Yes.
But your question is, if I'm you sitting there listening to that guy, he may know everything there is to know about horse racing. But the question still is, here's my question is, if you know that much about horse racing, why are you in my office?
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, that's kind of the obvious, isn't it?
Yes.
Something's not right here. I mean, you're the horse racing dude. You got it. You know horses front and backwards. So if you know that much about horse racing, why are you here? And then he will tell you what his problem is. And I'll tell you, I'm 98% sure this is what I'll tell you. Just like any gambler, is that there's no challenge in winning. That maybe he was real good with races where he knew the horses and he knew the trainers and he was hands-on there, maybe at the track, but that wasn't enough. He got bored with that, so now he started having to bet more and more. Now he's betting races on TV, right? Well, how's he making his decisions? And so once you do that, and I don't care what, I mean, I'm really glad you mentioned this, because you're going to run into people who know 100 times more about gambling than you do. And that's true for me all the time. You know, except for certain things. I mean, I know, you know, market index options more than most people, but other types of gambling, I don't know about them, but I don't need to. What I need to know is that with all you know, something went wrong. What is it? You know, how did your train get off the rails? You know, what did you start doing? And then now you're listening as the clinician who understands addiction and the mind of the addict, right?
Yes.
I mean, you're listening for what went wrong, and if we do a good enough job of listening and asking questions, the person sitting in our office will tell us, and then we're in a position to be able to help. Because remember, our job is to not solve any of their problems. We can't do that. Our job is to help them tell their story so that they hear their story. Let me say that again. Our job is to help them tell their story. Or another way of saying that is, our job is to help them tell themselves the truth, knowing that the better a job I can do at helping you tell the truth, the more you're in a position to confront yourself. And none of us change because somebody else confronts us. We only change when we confront ourselves. You know, it may be you, Sergio, saying, "Hey, Chris, you got a problem." And I say, yeah. And I may hear you say that, but it's only when I take that and tell myself that I got a problem that something shifts, right?
Yes.
So our job again is to play back a tape recorder, play back a video, hold up a mirror, and do that as best as we can. And so with somebody you don't know about horse racing, will tell me, but what you have to watch out for is them getting lost in telling you about horse racing, you know, as a construct, as opposed to along the way. You're asking them, okay, so if you know that much, then how did you end up in my office? You know? Because clearly something went wrong. Would you agree with that?
Oh, I agree 100%.
Yeah. And then it's no longer about horse racing. It's about an addict just doing what an addict does.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an important piece. And when it comes to the sports betting, which is where we got to, you know, they can tell you about sports betting, but to be honest with you, I'm really not that interested in the details of somebody's gambling. I mean, so what? You know, I don't really care about the details of your system. What I know and what you know is that whatever system that person sets up, or whatever line they draw for themselves that says, I'm not going to cross this line. What, I'm just going to have one. I'll just go to the bar and have one drink. No, I think I'll have another. So what we know is, if we're dealing with addiction, whatever system or whatever structure or whatever I tell myself I'm going to do, I end up not doing it. I mean, that's a given. that's across the board. You
Mhm.
know? Yeah. So thank you for throwing that in. That's an important piece.
Thanks.
When you say you didn't know what to do, did you kind of get lost in the horse racing aspect of it, or what?
Well, I have idea because I live close. I live in Los Angeles, and I remember he was talking about Santa Anita racetrack.
Santa Anita racetrack, right?
And I know what he said and everything, but I said, tell me a little bit more about how you bet on horses. And he started telling me those stories because I didn't expect that case.
Yeah,
This came
yeah,
from him.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
he went on. He told me all about horses. He was so excited, even going into the cranes with the horse, sleeping
Yeah.
at those tables with the horse.
And
It's the horse.
was he getting juiced as he was telling you?
Pardon me?
Was he getting juiced? Was he getting excited when he was telling you?
Oh, he was. He
Yeah.
was. And
So he was getting off on it.
He was. His pride. It was like everybody believed him and everybody rely on him for bettings because
Yeah.
he kind of brag about knowing about horses
Right.
because
Right.
he was kind of the lead person in the team.
Yeah.
But I don't remember how he got into the
How he got
problems.
in the program. Yeah.
I get into start losing money and start losing money.
Yeah.
Even a family that put money trust him and he lost the money.
Yeah.
Friend,
So he would have a lot of shame about that too,
he did.
because he's the expert, and now he's the expert who lost all the money doing what he's supposedly has some expertise in.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was the expert.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So interesting. So that leads me into a different piece. I mean, anybody else got anything they want to throw in at this point? All right. So I want to bleed over into this is sharing with you a legal case that I've been involved with. And this is a case in federal court in Chicago where a man who is 49 years old, actually 50 years old now, ended up robbing. He, in the progression of his addiction, robbed 2 banks. And so his family found me and asked me to do an evaluation and write a report. And so I did and sent it to the attorneys. And his sentencing is in Chicago on June 21st. And it was a sad situation for me. His father immigrated from Mexico and lost an arm in an accident when he was young, and his father became an abusive alcoholic and a gambler. He had a grandfather who was an alcoholic and a gambler, and the father developed Alzheimer's and died, and that was the trigger for this gentleman's progression into his gambling. So I want to read to you some of what he wrote that I included in my report. And none of this is, I mean, you can't identify anybody with this, but I mean, it's all public information anyway. But there's no names or anything in this. And then I want to comment on some of this for you guys, because I think it's relevant. You remember how we've talked in the past about this phenomena of people developing gambling problems later in life. And when they do, one of the things that we always want to look for is some kind of loss in their life. Not that it's there 100% of the time, but I'm telling you, in my experience, more often than not, it's there. That there's some kind of loss that precipitates them falling off the cliff into the addiction or starting that descent, however we want to frame it. All right, so this is, and when by the way, when I do an evaluation of somebody, what I do is I send them the 20 questions of Gamblers Anonymous, and instead of answering yes or no to those, I ask them to write out a paragraph or two response to each one, so I get a narrative as opposed to a yes or no, because that gives me a clue into their way of thinking. A yes or no doesn't help me with their thinking. Then I also ask them to write a history of their gambling. You know, and they'll say, well, where do you want me to? So you start wherever you want, write whatever you want. And so it's very informative what somebody writes, not only what they say, but how they say it and what they leave out. So, and I'll have them do this before I ever have a conversation with them. And then usually by the time I get their written work, I'm 90% done in terms of knowing what I'm dealing with and drafting a report then. And the purpose of what I do, it's issues of mitigation and sentencing, which simply means that, for example, in this case, this individual is facing hang on just a minute. Okay, I think I got it. This individual is facing something like it's 57, yeah, sentencing range 57 to 71 months, which sounds pretty draconian to me, but you know, for 2 bank robberies, the banks were in the, and I'm minimizing that, but for 2 bank robberies in the grocery stores, where he got a total of about $4,000, $3,000 or $4,000 in both the robberies. So here's what he wrote. He said, in both robberies, I never hid my face because I never planned to rob anything or anyone. My mental state was lost and diminished. I acted on crazy impulses and thoughts, all mostly due to this compulsive, insidious addiction. And as for the money, it was squandered and lost to gambling. All right, now to put that in context, here's his narrative. He says, my grandfather and father were both gamblers and alcoholics. Now, anytime we hear that, what we're going to want to do is reflect back on David Cummings' genetic research that he first announced the results of that in 1996, where he identified for the first time specific markers that were present in a statistically significant percentage of the population of individuals who both were diagnosed with a gambling addiction and alcohol dependence. So he did the first study in 1996 that showed that there was a genetic predisposition in some people. So when I hear this, I'm thinking, oh, something to look for. Both each cause needless suffering and pain to themselves and their families over their compulsions. I myself was a hard drinker and drug user through my late 20s and early 30s. He went on to describe his gambling as completely recreational until his mid-40s, when his father was diagnosed as Alzheimer's. He describes that experience as traumatic. He wrote the following narrative. This is from my report. This is his words. In the winter of 2013, my father became weak and frail. He was bedridden, and we came to the somber conclusion he wouldn't last the year. It was at this point in time where my own life became surreal and lost. Sometime in March 2013, now right there, that's the confirmation that I'm looking for. What's the trigger? Well, it's loss. Sometime in March 2013, my girlfriend at the time was going on a ski trip with her friends to Colorado. I dropped her off at the airport and drove back home. While on the expressway, I saw a billboard for Rivers Casino. That's a casino at right next to O'Hare International Airport in Chicago. I saw a billboard for Rivers Casino, and I thought to myself how I have never been there and should plan a visit. A night or two had passed, and after visiting my father, I found myself with alone time. I sat home thinking of my dad, and after a while I told myself I needed to get away from those sad thoughts for a bit. I remembered of the casino and decided to go for a visit. While driving there, it struck me how close the casino was to my home, not even 20 minutes. Now, I don't know what the significance of the closeness of the casino to his home was, because he's been incarcerated, we had limited opportunities to talk about some of the details. But for whatever reason, it was significant enough for him to say, it struck me how close the casino was to my home, not even 20 minutes away. I had a few $100s when I walked in. All right, now listen to this. All the bells, whistles, and music really perked me up. Now, this is somebody who describes himself as having an alcohol and drug problem in his 20s and 30s. He's walking, what's he talking about? This is the brain of an addict that's lighting up simply by walking into the casino environment with all the stimulation, all the auditory and visual stimulation going on. All right? So we know now that you know, there's the money part of the gambling, but there's also the part of this that's stimulating a part of his brain. You know, his dad's got Alzheimer's, his dad is dying, he's feeling sad. Just walking into the casino is a mood altering experience for him. So he said, all the bells, whistles, and music really perked me up. The themes and displays of all the machines were so high def, I couldn't keep my eyes off of them. I started playing on the quarter and 50-cent poker machines for a bit. I did okay on the poker machines, having won some money. I started getting bored with the small returns. Now he's telling you this is somebody that whatever it is never enough. I need more. So I took a chance and walked into the high limit room. I sat down in front of a $5 denomination slot machine, put some money in, and started playing. I was immediately disconnected from the people and sounds and everything around me. It was just me and the machine. Now that's somebody who fits our description of an individual who gets hooked the very first time they gamble. You know how people with alcohol problems say that in hindsight, they believe that they crossed the line into alcoholism with their very first drink. Others, it's not that true. Here's somebody who's hooked, clearly, right from the beginning. I was immediately disconnected, so that's the dissociative experience, from the people and sounds and everything around me. It was just me and the machine. The world around me was a distant echo, and I was numb of feeling. So now we're talking, now what's going on? He's under the influence. He's drugged up, as it were. I wasn't there long when I hit a very large jackpot. My heart raced and my temperature rose. I prayed to myself, thanking God for the blessing. And he put God, capital G-O-D. I was in a state of shock and elated at the same time. I received the prize mostly in a check and partly in cash. The casino made me a black member, which gave me the best free comps and allowed me to go play in their very private VIP room, but I didn't do that. I left the casino as soon as I could, still hyped and excited at what just happened. It was shortly after midnight when I drove home. And my comment on that in my report was the above narrative is a vivid example of how individuals get hooked on gambling. It is not uncommon for those who start gambling in response to some kind of traumatic loss in their lives in middle age. Not only does the gambling anesthetize or mitigate the pain, but at the level of metaphor, winning or a wager is an antidote for losing or loss. And we've talked about in these meetings before. Now, a number of things are noteworthy about that. And let me hold off on that because let me read you a little bit more of what he says. His father died in July of that year. He reported, "The leftover monies I had from the winnings helped me pay for the funeral expenses and plot and headstone. I thought at the time that maybe this was the reason for that windfall, and still think so till this day." After the funeral, he got word that his uncle had a stroke and died. In November of 2013, he went to the casino again, stayed there all night, and left a $1,500 winner. A week later, he hit a slot machine pot of $3,200, and he reported, "Those first months, I would go to gamble about once a week. When I would win, I'd be in a nice high, but when I'd lose, I would keep gambling to gain back my losses." Of course, then it progressed. The more he went, the more he started losing. Within a year, he was going to the casino 3 to 4 times a week and reports that he was always broke. By 2015, he was using credit cards to borrow money. And he stated, "My mind was constantly on playing and winning enough to get me back on track, at least financially." All right, so there's a number of interesting pieces in here. I mean, we all, those of you who worked with gamblers for a while, you recognize the progression of this. And this story is not news to you. But I think what jumped out to me that I really wanted to focus on is he said, "I prayed to myself, thanking God for the blessing." So and then he goes on to say that with the leftover money I had from the winnings, paid for my funeral expenses for my father and the plot and headstone. I thought at the time, back then when I won, that maybe this was the reason for that windfall, and I still think so to this day. So what he's telling himself in that very clearly is that him going into the casino and winning was a blessing or a gift from God. Now, what do you do with that? And I'm asking that more as a rhetorical question. I mean, how many of you have heard that? If you can respond. Man, I gotta believe some of you have heard that. Well, it raises some real interesting questions. First of all, it tells us a number of things. That if he was in treatment, and he's not with me, he's going to be doing time in jail, I'm pretty sure. But if he was in treatment, or if he and I were talking, then wouldn't it be a kind of a logical question of, okay, so your belief is that you winning this money and using this money to pay for your father's from God. Help me understand that. And whatever he would say about that. So clearly at that point, what he's doing, he's connecting a sense of spirituality or religion, whichever one it is, probably more religion, with his gambling. And that God is somehow the source of this blessing to him through winning a bet on a computer that's programmed, that somehow God is involved in determining whether he receives blessing or not. Well, if that's the case, then what does he do with God in his own head when he loses? I mean, that's always doesn't that sound like a kind of a logical place to, if I'm saying that God blessed me with this winning, and maybe God did, I don't know. I think God does bless us, but I'm not sure that's the vehicle that occurs. But maybe so. But it still leaves the question: well, if winning means that God bless me, then what do I do with the losing? How do I deal with that? How do I explain that? How do I reconcile that? And so as I was reading that, and I just sent that into the attorneys earlier this week, and I was thinking about talking with you guys, and one of the questions that I have for you is if and when issues of religion, people's belief in God, or disbelief in God comes up in the sessions, do you all feel comfortable addressing that with people? And I can tell you, I've talked to a lot of clinicians who don't. So again, that's a direct question I have for you guys, and I'm not sure if any one of you want to respond to that. But I will tell you that I think it's a huge, huge issue. And if you go there, great. If you don't go there, I think you're missing a tremendous opportunity. It's not about imposing any beliefs. It's asking this individual, what are his beliefs? How does he reconcile his beliefs? Now, he's also telling me something else too. And this is another piece that I wanted to add in that is that may be a little bit heady, but let me throw this in anyway. There is the theme of there's two. Well, let me see how I come at this. There's two ways of understanding justice. Well, everybody's looking for justice. We're all wanting to point out the injustice and solve the justice. And the legal system is called the justice system. But the justice system that we know is based on a kind of justice that is based on retribution or retributive justice, as it were. And retribution justice, which this gentleman is facing when he stands in front of a judge in a few weeks. Retributive justice is based on that our belief and our sense that sin and evil or people doing bad things are to be punished, and that we demand retribution from the offender or the sinner or the bad guy or the bad woman. And so retributive justice is a dualistic system of reward and punishment. Now, think about that for a second, that you don't have the sense of blessing without the other face of that, which is what? Curse? Maybe there's a better word, but for lack of a better one, let me use that. So when we're talking dualistic systems, then we carry that into gambler. When you're working with gamblers, you're working with somebody who in many ways is stuck with a dualistic mind, or a win-lose mentality, a win-lose, black-white, either or, all or nothing, yes or no. There's no gray, there's no in between, there's no ambiguity. In fact, psychologists who study gamblers talk about gamblers as a population of people who have an intolerance for ambiguity. Well, what a surprise. And we talk about gambling is the outcome of a wager is absolutely predictable in its unpredictability. It's absolutely predictable because we know that you're either going to win or lose, unless there's a certain game where there's a draw. We don't know whether it will be win or lose, but we know for certain that you're either going to win or lose. The outcome is absolutely clear. And so here's an individual, interestingly enough, that is stuck and views himself in the world through the lens of retributive justice, for which there is reward and punishment, blessing and curse. And who knows what kind of guilt or shame that he carried with him as a result of being abused. I'm sure a tremendous amount. But he goes into a casino and he experiences blessing. He experiences abundance as opposed to deprivation. And then he takes that abundance of that blessing home and he uses that to fund the funeral of the man who abused him. Well, there's all kinds of interesting parallels in that. And I'm saying this to you to underline what I frequently comment, in that with gambling, we want to deal with the very specifics of the gambling, but we also want to address the metaphor of gambling. What is the symbol? What does it represent? So retributive justice is based on a meritocracy, if you will. You either deserve it or you don't. You merit it or you don't merit it. And you know, our prisons, courtrooms, war, and probably oftentimes even the church, unfortunately, is very good at retributive justice. Well, the great spiritual teachers and great spiritual traditions operate according to a different principle, seems to be, which is restorative justice. Now, restorative justice with restorative justice, what we want to do is return or restore the individual into a useful position in community, or a sense of self, you know, or that I belong, that I'm okay, that I'm part of something, as opposed to being alone or in isolation. There's a great, I can't remember whether I mentioned this, there's a guy named, a psychologist named Bill Plotkin, who's well known in the area of masculine spirituality. And he, most of the treatment workshops that he does are out in nature. I think out in Colorado and maybe Utah. I forget where all he's operating at. It's been about 5 or 6 years since I was with him. One of the books that he wrote is called Soulcraft. So his name is Plotkin, Plotkin. And one of his books is Soulcraft. And in there, he talks about something, a principle that's very fascinating, called the loyal soldier. And he draws on a story that came out, I think, in the 1960s. And after, somewhere in the 1960s, on one of the Pacific Islands, they found an old Japanese soldier that did not know that the war had ended, you know, 25 or 30 years ago, or however many years ago it was. And his oath of loyalty to death to the emperor, he was still living out of that place. Well, they found him and somehow were able to talk to him and convince him that the war was over and it was time to go home. And they even had to bring some, you know, they went back and found his people who had been his superior officers to come in and talk to him. It's a fascinating story. Now, what they did was, you know, unlike how we treated the Vietnam vets when they came back, what they did was, when he went back to Japan, they thanked him for his service to his country. They thanked him for his loyalty. Instead of shaming him for being such an idiot, for not knowing the war was over, or for fighting for a losing cause, they thanked him for his service. And they said, your service as a soldier is no longer needed, but we need your service elsewhere. In other words, they invited him to beat his sword into plowshares. And so you know, Bill refers to that that story and turns it into metaphor, into something called the loyal soldier, where all of us have these allegiances that are outdated, things that we keep do, beliefs that we still have, that we live by, that long outlive their usefulness. I mean, we know that defense mechanisms that we develop in childhood that serve a legitimate function to protect ourselves, we keep doing those things long after the need for those is over. And so, you know, a lot of the work that we do with people, you know, in early adulthood and later on, is identifying what are my defense mechanisms, and do I really need them anymore? I mean, you know, my father's dead, my mother's dead. I don't need to protect myself from them anymore, but I'm still living with those mechanisms. So I think we all understand that. But this this whole notion of loyalty is a very powerful one. But in this, what they did was, instead of punishing him, they manifested arguably a form of restorative justice, where they engaged in a ritual to restore him to the community. And it struck me with that, this whole notion of restoration. And by the way, we don't have to go to the great spiritual tradition. We go to Alcoholics Anonymous. That is a whole program of restorative justice. And the way we get there is not by merit, not out of virtue, but out of brokenness, because we screwed up. That the keys to recovery, the keys to the kingdom, to the promises, as it were, in the big book, take place in several different ways. First of all, it takes place by admitting that I got a problem that's bigger than my ability to solve it. And we admit that within the context of community, whether it's to you as their therapist or somebody else. And so if you think about it, the fact of somebody sitting in your office, one of your questions for them, either you're going to ask them directly or you're going to listen to that, is where is this person? Are they acknowledging? Are they sitting in my office, and are they at a place where they're acknowledging that I got a problem that I can't solve? Or this thing has me beat? And I will tell you that for me, it's really a very clear dividing line with gamblers that I work with as to how effective I'm going to be in terms of really helping them move through this, as to where they are in terms of their admission of their own powerlessness. Now we go to stages of change and that sort of thing, which you all are familiar with. I've got a 21-year-old kid coming in another hour or so, who lost a bunch of money at the card rooms. I think I've told you about it, but mom bailed him out. And so in a sense, he hadn't lost anything. And so he's felt some pain, but he has no sense of his own powerlessness. So instead of a dualism with me, either gamble or not gamble, what I do with him is take a position of basically helping him understand and be conscious of what he does while he's gambling. I have no need for him to stop gambling. I have no need for him to continue gambling. My job is to simply be present to him, and to be an interpreter, to hold up the mirror, to ask him questions, to challenge his way of thinking. But I'm well aware that he's not like somebody coming in who's just had the crap beat out of him and they're saying, man, I got to do my life radically different. That's not where he is. And I don't need for him to be there. And so I'm saying that to you guys also, that for some people, it's important that we put aside any need that we have for them to be abstinent. And that may seem kind of paradoxical or contradictory, because what I do is I want you to be well. And I don't believe that this kid can really be well. I say kid, he's 20 years old, continuing to gamble, but I also know that he has to continue gambling until he's ready to stop. And there's nothing that I'm going to say or do that's going to get in the way of that. But hopefully what I can do is help him be conscious along the way. So what we're always looking to do, what I am, is help people move from this place of living with retributive justice, especially inside themselves. And you'll hear many people, if you listen and you ask, talk about the guilt, the shame that they have. And then the question becomes, well, how do you punish yourself? Some people punish themselves by losing money gambling. How do you punish yourself? And then that clearly takes us over to the realm of forgiveness. How do you experience forgiveness? I was talking with a woman earlier today who served time in prison on some drug charges, has a big gambling problem, but there's a guy that basically sheltered her as a fugitive from justice. and they found her at his house, and he had drugs there that were not hers, they were his, and so he got busted for possession also. She served a couple of years. She's out. And for the last 5 years, he's been holding her emotionally hostage, saying, it's your fault that I got busted, and now I can't get a job, and it's your job to take care of me. I mean, you have to pay me. She's an emotional hostage. Now, she got obviously severe problems with codependency, but part of her gambling was that she believes that she's been sentenced. She owes him an eternal debt that he reminds her of frequently. And so what we were talking about today, as I said, you know, when you went in front of the judge, what did the judge say? She said, well, you know, sentence me to prison. Well, for how long? So 2.5 years. Okay, so when you got out, had you served your time? Yes. Okay. And separate from any internal guilt or shame that you carried, you served your time. Yeah. So it was finite. Yes. Okay, so then this debt that you owe to this guy that you keep giving money to, what's the sentence there? And she paused for a second and she said, well, seems like a life sentence. I said, yeah, it kind of does seem like it. Isn't that interesting? You know, how is it that you got a life sentence? And that's a theme, and I think I've talked with you guys about this before. That is a theme that I go back to over and over and over again with, and I offer to you for the people who are carrying guilt, which is probably 110% of everybody you see, and is punishing themselves in some way or another, which is probably 110% of the people that you see. And given that that's the case, how do they break out of this cycle of retribution, of merit? You know, I can't undo the past. I can't get back the money that I lost. I can't fix what was broke. Well, what's the remedy? Well, ultimately, it's to move to a whole different way of thinking. You know, have you served your time? And so it's helpful for you to think in terms of, as a clinician, when someone is carrying guilt, for you to literally ask them, because everybody, we watch enough TV, we understand the courtroom. Well, so yeah, you did what you did. So what was the sentence? What do you mean, what was the sentence? Well, when somebody's guilty, they go in front of a judge. The judge sentences them to pay a fine, to serve time in jail. What was the sentence for what you did? Just asking that question it has the effect of turning on the light for somebody. And it's going to take you miles down the road when you ask them that question of what's the sentence? What are you imprisoned? What is the source of your imprisonment? Because I can tell you that many gamblers look to the gambling as a way of escape, as a mechanism of escape. All addicts do. So anyway, those are a few of the thoughts that have been bouncing around in my head. We just got a couple of minutes left, so let me pause and see if that stirred up anything for anybody that you want to make a comment on, or whether that's just too off the charts for anybody to say anything to. Anybody? All right, so if not, what I will do is say that I hope this has been beneficial for you guys. I'm actually going to be out in your neighborhood this weekend. I'm flying out to Portland on Saturday morning. Then Joan and I are going to drive down to Eugene. Her son is graduating from the university. I think it's on Monday or something like that. Then we're flying back Tuesday. So I look forward to every chance I get to be out in Oregon. Is always a gift and a blessing to me. But I'm also aware that I don't live out there and don't have to go through all the periods of rain with no sunshine too. So every sword has two edges, right? So you guys take care of yourself. Peace to each of you, and look forward to visiting with you next month. Take care. Goodbye.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
All right, signing off.